Welcome back. As talks to secure peace in Ukraine began in Jeddah this week, it's become clear that Russia wants a ceasefire only on its terms. And the United States has little appetite to be the security backstop. The Prime Minister hosted nearly 30 world leaders in a virtual meeting of Ukraine's allies yesterday. But where could his so-called coalition of the willing stand in all this? Let's speak to the former National Security Advisor, Lord Ricketts. Morning, Peter.
Good morning.
Is the prospect of a peacekeeping force involving NATO boots on the ground a real one or just a negotiating tactic?
Well, I think Keir Starmer has done an excellent job in the 3 weeks since that ambush in the Oval Office in pulling the Europeans together, in developing a plan for how Europe can really make a contribution towards peace in Ukraine. And I can absolutely see why he's promoting the idea of a military force. But I've been in the room many times as a policymaker when ministers were deciding to put troops into Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya. And it's now you've got to ask the tough questions because the intentions are absolutely honest, of course, and I respect that. But what would a European force actually do in Ukraine? We hear much of this term, a reassurance force, which sounds quite reassuring. What it really means is a deterrent force, I think, a force capable of deterring Putin from going back to war in Ukraine. To be credible, a deterrence force has to be willing to fight. So are we actually saying that this force might one day have to fight the Russians in Ukraine? I think it's a genuine question. And the way to avoid it, of course, is to have a cast-iron American guarantee that if the force got into trouble, the Americans would come in and support. That's what the backstop means. I just don't think Trump is going to give that kind of commitment. So while I admire the work going into this, and maybe there are ways that European forces can help in Ukraine, perhaps training and in the background, I think a formed fighting force is a considerable risk without an American clear guarantee.
Do you think that guarantee will ever be forthcoming from this president?
Frankly, no. Because Trump's brand is to pull Americans out of military conflict. I mean, he hit the Houthis overnight, but that's with long-range missiles, no American troops anywhere near Yemen. So I don't think that he will give a credible guarantee that if a European force got into real trouble, he would come to the rescue and again, implicitly take on the Russians directly. And the Russians will, of course, confront the force in Ukraine. One of their great grievances has been that NATO has been moving towards Russian frontiers.
That's what Putin said this was all about.
The last thing they want is to see NATO forces running around in Ukraine. So they're bound to take the force on in some way, whether actually conflict directly or dark arts, deniable operations, sabotage. I don't know. It would be a very risky situation unless the Russians are prepared to accept this force, which I don't see as likely either.
So what do you think Keir Starmer is doing here? Because presumably he must be getting wise advice of the kind that you're giving.
I mean, I suppose he's preparing the ground for if we did get that kind of American security guarantee, then the Europeans must be ready to follow through with the force. Fine. But I think also the meeting yesterday was talking about other ways of supporting Ukraine, which are equally valid. More arms, more equipment, tighter sanctions on Russia, using some of those frozen Russian assets for reconstruction in Ukraine. That's all pressure on Russia. And if we're going to get Russia to a sensible negotiation around the table, there's got to be serious pressure on Russia as well. We haven't seen very much of that so far.
Well, when we talk about serious pressure, I mean, the White House has talked about, or the president has talked about things that he could do to Russia that nobody's understood yet, that would be disastrous. The call yesterday talked about more sanctions and so on. Are the sanctions actually working? They don't seem to have impeded Mr. Putin's progress at all.
Well, I think they have weakened the Russian economy. You don't see it very much from the outside, but the sanctions on technology transfers to Russia, for example, I think are meaning that the Russian economy is weakening inside. It hasn't stopped Putin being able to fund the war, no. And one step which really would do that would be to depress the oil price, because the Russian economy is very, very dependent on oil prices. And that is something that Trump has mentioned. But I have to say that the pressure put on Ukraine has been much more specific than anything that we know he said to Putin. So I think in the next round of this, when the Americans have to compare the Ukraine offer to go straight away to a ceasefire for 30 days with this Putin proposal, which is yes, but a whole series of conditions, we need to feel that the Americans are putting much more pressure on Putin, including threatening much tougher sanctions.
I'm always a bit reluctant to put down geopolitics to relationships between individuals, because I think that's a lot of that is for journalists. But objective forces, how many guns have you got, economy and so on, are much more influential. However, there are a couple of big relationships here. One is between, interestingly, Starmer and Macron. And I'm curious what you think about this. Macron likes the idea of French leadership, like all French presidents do, of Europe. Do you think he's ready to accommodate a strong role for the United Kingdom in the shape of Sir Keir Starmer?
Well, I think the UK-France relationship has been turbocharged by the war in Ukraine and by now Trump and the unpredictability and turbulence of Trump. And the two are quite an interesting duo, actually, because Emmanuel Macron brings 8 years of experience. He's very good at these big international events. And Starmer brings political longevity, which Macron doesn't have. So Starmer's got the political stability at home, Macron's got the experience. They seem to be working extremely well together. And that is good because we are the two natural leaders of security in Europe, the two biggest military forces. It's good to see Britain back at the heart of European security. No, I don't think Macron has a problem with that. He does have a problem when it comes to defence industry cooperation because he's quite keen to protect the French defence industry with these EU rules. And he's not very keen, I think, on seeing what we need to have, which is a much more open and effective European defence industry. That aside, I think it's working extremely well between the two countries.
Well, that's one bromance in the making. The other bromance would be, I guess, between the man in the White House and the man in the Kremlin. I think you're sceptical about President Trump's methods of diplomacy, but he's clearly had an effect. Do you think, first of all, that what is happening here is Putin is playing for time, or do you think actually something real is taking place?
Yeah, well, I agree with you that Trump has made this negotiation possible. I accept that. The kind of unpredictability and the brutality, the way he's approached it, has opened a space for negotiation. That's true. I do think Putin is playing for time, yes. First of all, I think he wants to try and push the Ukrainians out of that bit of Russia around Kursk, which the Ukrainians have been occupying. Secondly, I think he hates the idea of a short-term ceasefire with no strings attached, which he thinks would allow the Ukrainians to regroup and rearm. At the moment, the Russians are on the offensive, so it's not in his interest. So he's playing for time. He's avoiding saying no to Trump, but I think he's stringing it out.
I don't want to bring this too close back to home, but of course, one of the things that we always have to be worried about these days is that there are new methods of warfare, particularly cyber warfare. Do you think that we become more vulnerable because of the prominent role that Starmer's playing in all of this to Russian hackers and all of that?
Well, no, I think we've been vulnerable to that Russian sabotage and dark arts, as I call them, for years. We remember the poisoning of Mr. Litvinenko on the streets of London. We remember the Skripal poisoning. We've seen what Russia is capable of for years and years. We've seen acts of sabotage, strange fires developing in arms factories overnight. So we have to be prepared for this. Yes, it is going to grow, but we are not alone in it, and I don't think what Keir Starmer is doing is putting it as particularly more at risk. I think all European countries have to be aware that as far as Putin is concerned, he's at war with us. Doesn't feel like that when you walk around in London, but that's what Putin thinks. So we have to be tough and vigilant, and we have to increase defence spending. There's absolutely no way around that.
In the end, Peter, if you had to lay a bet, what's the end game here, and what is the best pathway to the best possible outcome?
Well, the best conceivable outcome is that the war finishes with Ukraine clearly coming out of it as a country with its independence, with its right to decide its own future, with its right to move towards NATO, and Russia having clearly lost. Realistically, Ukraine's not going to drive Russia out of every inch of Ukrainian territory, but an outcome where Russia is seen to have failed in what it did, started 3 years ago. That would be the best outcome. I have to say there's quite a high likelihood that a ceasefire, even it can be achieved, won't last, and that for the next year or so we may well see the fighting continuing, unless and until the Russians...
A year?
Well, I mean, another fighting season, unless Trump is really prepared to double down on Putin and show him that there's no way that he can continue this grinding war, that he's prepared to arm Ukraine and support Ukraine. In the end, then, the factors that we were talking about, the weakness of the Russian economy, will come into play. But I don't see them pressuring Putin into a settlement soon. And unless Trump is prepared to do it, I fear this could drag on for some time yet. I hope not, but that's what I fear.
Peter Ricketts, Lord Ricketts, come back and talk to us about this in the future. Thank you very much indeed.